Washington, District of Columbia, October 12, 1968. The late afternoon sun slanted through the wide plate glass windows of Patterson & Sons fine footwear, slicing the shop into warm amber light and sharp geometric shadows. The beams glinted off rows of polished leather Oxfords and Italian loafers, arranged with military precision, each pair reflecting the obsessive craftsmanship that had defined the store for nearly 50 years. Behind the counter, kneeling on a well-worn cushion, was Walter Patterson, a man whose unassuming profession concealed an extraordinary gift. As he wrapped a tape measure around the foot of Ambassador Henri Beaumont, the French cultural attaché, Walter's practiced fingers moved with the same calm assurance his grandfather had carried with him when he opened the shop back in 1921. Customers believed they were merely buying shoes. In reality, they were unknowingly stepping into the presence of a man whose mastery of observing human gait would soon expose one of the most deeply embedded Soviet intelligence officers ever planted inside the United States government. Beaumont, with his colorful scarf and impeccable diplomatic manners, had been coming to Patterson & Sons for 6 years, always punctual, always requesting the same black cordovan Oxford, and always carrying himself with the faint melancholy of a man who had seen too many political crises to believe in lasting stability. Walter knew his foot measurements by heart: length, width, bunion accommodation, the slight arch support deficit that appeared to worsen in winter months. Yet he still measured every time, honoring the ritual of precision that had been passed down through 3 generations of Pattersons. This consistency, this quiet devotion to detail, had become a sanctuary for Walter amid the escalating storms of the world outside. For America, 1968 was a year carved into collective memory with a dull, unrelenting blade. The Vietnam War raged with no victory in sight. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia that August had crushed the Prague Spring and sent shockwaves through Western intelligence agencies. Political assassinations, protests, and cultural upheaval fractured the United States from within. In Washington, a city where embassies, congressional offices, think tanks, and covert operatives existed almost on top of one another, paranoia and urgency mingled with daily life like invisible smog. Yet, inside this shoe shop, Walter clung to normalcy, trusting in the tangible certainty of leather, thread, and human footsteps. When Beaumont finally stood to leave, offering Walter a familiar warm nod, the cobbler logged the order in a leather-bound book that looked as old as the shop itself. His assistant, David Chen, a bright 24-year-old Georgetown student, was busy processing invoices near the counter. Outside, traffic hummed along Connecticut Avenue, diplomats and lobbyists passing under the fading sunlight as naturally as blood through arteries. There was something almost poetic, almost ironic, about how close the beating heart of American political power was to this modest storefront. The next series of customers came and went in the comforting rhythm of the trade. A State Department secretary fretted over which pair of pumps would survive a long diplomatic reception. A retired admiral with stiff joints examined slippers as though they were part of a classified procurement review. A young engaged couple whispered nervously about matching wedding shoes. These interactions made Walter smile, proof that even in a world bracing for geopolitical disaster, people continued to seek small comforts. At 5:30, when Walter was moments from closing early, the bell over the door chimed once more. The man who entered seemed the very embodiment of forgettability, approximately 40, slightly graying, dressed in a charcoal suit, that suggested responsibility without influence. His expression was neutral, his posture ordinary, his presence unremarkable enough to dissolve into any crowd between DuPont Circle and Capitol Hill. And yet, something triggered in Walter's mind the moment the man took his first step inside. It wasn't a conscious realization, not at first. It was more like the subtle shift in atmosphere before a thunderstorm. A flicker in Walter's instincts, refined by decades of watching how people move, adjusting shoes to their unique patterns of weight and balance. The stranger's footfalls were too precise, each stride identical in length, each movement executed with an almost mathematical rhythm. His spine stood unnaturally straight, not with the relaxed confidence of an American military veteran, but with the rigid, almost ceremonial posture Walter had seen only once before, in a Soviet trade representative 6 years earlier. Most Americans walked with small asymmetries, a slight lean, a relaxed arm swing, a casual looseness born of freedom and informal culture. But this man, his arms swung wider than necessary, his fingers stayed extended, not curled. His motion was purposeful, rehearsed, almost mechanical. It was the gait of a man taught to walk, not by life or personality, but by rigorous institutional training. "Good afternoon," the man said with a clean Midwestern accent. "My name is Martin Crawford. I work for the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Economic Analysis." Walter nodded, guiding him to the fitting area, while his thoughts churned beneath a calm exterior. Crawford's story fit perfectly within Washington's bureaucratic landscape. His business card looked authentic. His conversation about conferences and presentations sounded plausible. But his movements betrayed him, or rather, betrayed something foreign, concealed beneath layers of ordinary American mannerisms. As the fitting began, Walter's observations deepened. Crawford's shoes were worn flat across the heels, a sign of symmetrical, precision-trained foot placement. The soles showed almost no variation in pressure distribution. Even the way he sat, back straight, knees at a perfect angle, hands resting motionless, resembled posture training from Soviet military academies, training designed to eliminate the casual slouching of Western civilians. Could Walter be mistaken? Could Crawford simply be a former Marine or Army officer shaped by years of drill? Perhaps. But the Soviet walk, rigid, symmetric, methodical, was something Walter had researched after encountering Konstantin Volkov years before. And seeing it again now, in 1968, when Cold War tensions simmered dangerously close to boiling, was enough to raise alarms he could not ignore. When the fitting concluded and Crawford left the shop, Walter watched him through the window, tracking the cadence of his footsteps as they carried him down Connecticut Avenue. The world might have dismissed such observations as trivial, but Walter knew better. His father, a former OSS operative, had taught him the truth long ago. People reveal their secrets in how they move long before they reveal them in what they say. As darkness settled over Washington, Walter remained alone in the quiet shop, staring at the order form bearing the name Martin Crawford. He felt the weight of an impossible question pressing against his mind. Had a Soviet spy just walked into his store, and had Walter, a simple cobbler, been the only one able to perceive it? That night, long after the bell above the front door had stopped ringing and the last of the Connecticut Avenue traffic had thinned into scattered headlights, Walter sat alone in his small office at the back of the shop. The ledger lay open in front of him, but his eyes were fixed on a single line of ink. Crawford, Martin, Depot of Commerce, Bureau of Economic Analysis, Beside the name were the measurements, the shoe model, the deposit amount. All of it ordinary. All of it respectable. All of it, he now suspected, a meticulously arranged lie. He turned the problem over in his mind, the way a craftsman evaluates a flawed seam, slowly, methodically, from every angle. On paper, Crawford was the very definition of Washington's faceless middle bureaucracy. The Bureau of Economic Analysis was not a glamorous agency. It processed trade statistics, compiled economic indicators, ran models that fed into policy briefings few citizens ever saw. It was precisely the kind of office that appeared dull on the surface, and thus, in the logic of espionage, precisely the kind of place where timely, sensitive information could be quietly siphoned away without attracting attention. Walter thought of his father, George, who'd served in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. George never bragged about his service. His stories came only in fragments. How a misbuttoned coat had once betrayed a German infiltrator. How muddy boots in a supposedly neutral village had suggested recent troop movement. How the tiniest overlooked detail could redraw entire maps of risk. People carry their origins in their bodies, George had told him once. Watch how a man walks, and you'll learn more than from a dozen clever lies. Walter leaned back, staring at the ceiling as those words replayed in his mind. Was he really about to stake that inherited instinct against the possibility that he was simply tired, stressed by the turmoil of 1968, seeing conspiracies where there were none? The country was on edge. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were both dead. Chicago had become a battleground during the Democratic National Convention. Protests raged over Vietnam. The atmosphere in Washington was thick with suspicion and fear. Thousands of people saw potential threats everywhere. Was he just becoming one more voice in the chorus? He looked again at the order form, the address, an apartment building on 16th Street Northwest, the telephone number, a local Washington exchange. Nothing exotic, nothing out of place. He imagined calling the police and trying to explain. "Yes, officer. My concern is the way he swings his arms." They would write him off as a nervous shopkeeper feeding Cold War hysteria. Still, the gait nagged at him. The symmetrical wear on the heels, the straight spine, the slight delay in facial expressions, as if they were chosen instead of felt. The eyes that scanned, not wandered. It all formed a pattern, the way a misaligned stitch stands out to a professional. No single detail was definitive, but together, they did not feel accidental. Walter decided he needed more than intuition. He would test the story. The next day, with the shop momentarily empty, he lifted the receiver of the cream-colored rotary phone and dialed the main number for the Department of Commerce. When the operator answered, he requested to be connected to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and then, with his heart beating faster than it should have, asked for Martin Crawford. The pause on the line felt like a lifetime. Then came the answer that sent a chill through him. Yes, there was a Martin Crawford in that bureau. Yes, the operator could transfer him. Walter hung up before the call went through, his palm damp against the handset. So the identity existed within the government's own directories. That could have been reassuring. Instead, it unsettled him further. Walter had read enough newspapers, heard enough stories from his father, to know that Soviet intelligence did not rely solely on forged legends anymore. They embedded their officers into real jobs, with real documentation and real access. A listing in a government directory no longer meant someone was benign. Sometimes, it meant the opposite. Days later, on a gray October afternoon, Walter took the risk of going a step further. He closed the shop early under the pretext of needing to visit a supplier and drove his aging Chrysler up 16th Street. The address from the order form turned out to be a 7-story brick building with Art Deco details, the kind of respectable but unspectacular structure that housed mid-level professionals all across the city. Flower boxes sat in the windows. A worn brass directory panel listed names that sounded unremarkably American. It was, in other words, exactly where a genuine commerce analyst might live, or exactly where a deeply embedded intelligence officer might hide in plain sight. Walter parked across the street. The windshield framed the scene like a surveillance photograph. He felt foolish, almost embarrassed. What did he expect to see? Men in trench coats handing over documents? Courier bags stamped with Soviet insignia? This wasn't one of his father's OSS stories set in wartime France. This was Washington in peacetime, or the closest thing the Cold War ever allowed to peacetime. The building looked ordinary. The street looked ordinary. Even the autumn wind blowing leaves along the curb looked ordinary. He was about to admit defeat, start the car, and drive back to the security of his shop when the front door of the building opened. Out stepped Martin Crawford. If Walter had harbored any doubt that his earlier impressions had been colored by imagination, it vanished in that instant. The clothes were different. Casual slacks, a sweater, a jacket suitable for the chilly air. But the movement was exactly the same. The rigid spine, the measured stride, the arm swing locked into that slightly exaggerated arc. It was as if Crawford's body belonged to one world and his clothing to another, one Soviet, one American, coexisting uneasily in the same man. Crawford walked to a nearby bus stop and took up a position with a folded newspaper in his hands. At first, the scene was so mundane as to be almost comical. A man waiting for public transportation, just another government employee living the unglamorous life of federal service. Then Walter noticed the detail that made his breath hitch. The newspaper was upside down, not in an obvious slapstick manner that would draw attention, but skewed, turned at an angle that made genuine reading impossible, yet might pass unnoticed to anyone nearby, not paying close attention. To Walter's trained eye, it looked less like someone reading and more like someone holding a newspaper as a kind of shield, performing the act of waiting, performing the act of blending in, but missing a basic nuance of the performance. It was a small error, so small that millions of pedestrians in Washington would have walked past and never registered it. But to a man who had built his life on noticing how people truly occupied their bodies, the mistake was deafening. Walter drove back to the shop with his mind in a whirl. The pattern now felt undeniable. The posture, the gait, the scanning eyes. The delayed expressions, the upside-down newspaper. Any one of those might have meant nothing. Together, they painted a portrait of a man trained to observe, to pretend, to inhabit a disguise. Someone who had spent years studying how to be American, and still occasionally forgot the simple parts. By the next morning, Walter had made his decision. He fetched the phone directory, flipped to the section he had never imagined he would actually use, and found the number for the FBI's Washington field office. His hand trembled slightly as he dialed. When the receptionist answered and transferred him to a duty officer, Walter took a breath and did something he never expected to do in his life. He reported a suspected Soviet intelligence officer. He described the posture, the walking pattern, the unusual symmetry in the wear of the shoes, the upside-down newspaper at the bus stop. He explained his professional background, his decades of studying human movement, his prior encounter with a Soviet trade representative who had walked the same way. On the other end of the line, the officer listened politely, his tone professional, but edged with a skepticism Walter could feel even without seeing his face. The officer asked questions, took notes, thanked Walter for his vigilance, and said that someone would follow up if warranted. It was the kind of phrase that floated on the surface of bureaucracy, carefully non-committal, infinitely polite. When Walter hung up, he felt suddenly foolish, as though he had overstepped, as though he had tried to insert himself into a world where he did not belong. 2 days later, the bell above the door of Patterson & Sons rang, and 2 men in dark suits stepped inside. They were not customers. They introduced themselves quietly. Special Agent Morrison and Special Agent Keller, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterintelligence Division. Morrison was compact, alert, with the controlled energy of someone who had worn a uniform before trading it for a suit. Keller was older, lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, the kind of man who had heard too many lies to be easily impressed by anything. They asked to speak to Walter in private, and in the cramped office behind the shop, they laid out a truth that made his nerves steady rather than shatter. His call had not vanished into some forgotten file. The name Martin Crawford had already appeared on their radar. Agents assigned to internal security at the Department of Commerce had been quietly investigating irregularities in the handling of sensitive economic data. Information that should have remained compartmentalized was turning up in places it shouldn't. Foreign trade delegations that seemed mysteriously well prepared for American negotiating strategies. Adversary governments reacting to embargo discussions with uncanny speed. The leaks were subtle, but consistent enough to be alarming. A list of possible access points had been compiled, and Crawford's name was on it, not as a prime suspect, but as one of many with the right clearances and opportunities. What Walter had provided, Keller explained, was entirely different. Behavioral evidence pointing towards specialized training. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, one that aligned with their worst-case scenarios, and in counterintelligence, patterns mattered. Most people don't watch how anyone walks, Morrison told him, his tone a blend of respect and curiosity. You do. That's not paranoia, that's expertise, and right now, we could use it. They wanted his help. Not as a spy or an undercover agent, the very idea made Walter's stomach tighten, but as a trained observer. Crawford was scheduled to return in 4 days to pick up his custom shoes. The FBI would set up surveillance around the shop, photograph him, follow him after he left, begin the painstaking process of mapping his movements and contacts. All Walter had to do, they stressed, was act normally. No alarms, no hints, no deviation from his usual professional manner. If Crawford sensed even a whisper of suspicion, he might disappear, and with him, a network they were only beginning to perceive. Walter agreed, his voice quiet but steady. He had spent a lifetime caring about the way people moved. Now, for the first time, that obsession might help protect his country. The 4 days that followed crawled by like a slow march in heavy boots. Walter tried to lose himself in the rhythm of the shop, measuring, advising, fitting, but his mind kept drifting back to that order form, that name, that rigid walk. He said nothing to David, claiming vague personal concerns whenever his distraction became too obvious. The secret sat between his ribs like a stone. On the morning of the appointed day, the sky over Washington hung low and gray. A cold wind pushed dry leaves down Connecticut Avenue. Walter unlocked the door to Patterson & Sons, straightened the displays, and tried to quiet his nerves. Somewhere outside, in parked cars and nearby businesses, the FBI was waiting. And at precisely 11 a.m., the man who called himself Martin Crawford would walk back through that door. At 11:01 a.m., sharp, as though synchronized with an unseen metronome, the bell above the door jingled, and Martin Crawford stepped into Patterson & Sons. The overcast light from outside trailed after him for a moment, casting his silhouette across the polished wooden floor. To any ordinary observer, he looked like nothing more than a punctual bureaucrat fulfilling a routine errand. But to Walter, who had spent the past 4 days replaying every second of their first interaction, Crawford's entrance landed like a physical weight. The straight spine, the careful stride, the precise angle of arm swing. It was all exactly as before, a living reminder of why the FBI was now watching from the shadows. Walter greeted him with calm professionalism, masking the tension that thrummed beneath the surface. The custom shoes sat in a labeled box behind the counter, prepared with the meticulous care his family had built its reputation on for nearly half a century. When Walter retrieved them, he forced himself to breathe evenly, to behave exactly as he would with any customer. That was the role he needed to play. That was the only way this operation could succeed. Crawford sat in the fitting area, removed his worn shoes, and slid his feet into the new Oxfords with a measured motion. He stood and began walking a slow circuit around the shop, testing the fit. To Walter's keen eye, the cadence of his steps remained as unsettlingly consistent as ever, like a marching drill softened only at the edges for civilian disguise. Yet Crawford himself appeared entirely at ease, offering mild praise for the craftsmanship and noting that the shoes fit him just right. His expression was neutral, his tone devoid of any inflection that might betray suspicion. For a moment, Walter wondered if he had misjudged everything. Perhaps Crawford was nothing more than an exacting, posture-conscious bureaucrat. Perhaps the upside-down newspaper had been an absent-minded mistake. Perhaps. Then the door burst open. A young woman rushed inside, breathless and disheveled, blurting apologies as she explained that she desperately needed professional shoes for a job interview. She was dressed in casual clothes that clashed with her urgency. Faded jeans, a sweater, hair only half tamed. Her voice shook with earnest panic, the kind that came from real stakes, real fear. Walter shifted into the instinctive mode of service: reassure, guide, assist. For a moment, the world shrank back to ordinary retail, but only for a moment. Because Crawford had stopped walking, he stood at the doorway, watching the young woman with an alertness that felt out of place. When he looked at his watch, the gesture was deliberate, almost calculated. Then something in his expression, barely noticeable, but unmistakably controlled, shifted. He turned back to Walter and said he wanted to exchange the shoes for a different style, claiming the cap-toe design felt too formal for his office. Walter froze internally. This was not normal. Customers occasionally changed their minds, yes, but they didn't do so at the exact moment another customer rushed in, creating a distraction. They didn't time their decisions to coincide with scenarios where the salesperson's attention would be divided. And they certainly didn't do it with the expression Crawford now wore: calm, unreadable, quietly evaluative. This was a test, a security probe, an operative assessing whether the environment allowed for unobserved access. It was a move straight out of tradecraft manuals Walter had never read, but instinctively recognized. Create distraction, look for vulnerabilities, evaluate whether the back room could be accessed or whether sensitive information, addresses, billing logs, order forms, could be glimpsed. Walter made a choice. With a polite smile, he told Crawford he would be happy to handle the exchange, but first he needed to give his full attention to the young woman. Her situation was urgent, he explained. It would take about 30 minutes. He offered Crawford coffee, suggested he could wait, or return later. Crawford hesitated, just for a beat, enough for Walter's suspicions to harden into certainty. Then he agreed to return in 2 hours. He left without any sign of frustration or concern, disappearing into the gray light outside. The bell chimed once more, sealing the moment like a punctuation mark. Across the street, Keller, stationed in the French restaurant's window, caught Walter's eye. Walter gave him the smallest nod. Something is happening. When the young woman finally chose a pair of pumps and hurried out, Agent Morrison entered the shop immediately. Walter laid out the entire interaction, describing Crawford's timing, the subtle calculation in his expression, the nature of the request. That, Morrison said grimly, was absolutely a probe. He was checking how easily you could be distracted and what he could access. Your instincts were spot on. The next 2 hours passed with excruciating slowness. Walter felt as though every tick of the clock was amplified inside the shop's walls. Outside, agents repositioned themselves, ready for Crawford's return. Walter remained composed on the surface, though underneath his calm exterior, a faint tremor of adrenaline pulsed through him. Finally, precisely 2 hours later, the bell chimed again. Crawford walked back in. This time, Walter had prepared the selection of alternate shoe styles in a layout that ensured Crawford would never be unobserved. Every choice Walter presented kept the man within his direct line of sight. Every step Crawford took around the shop was mirrored in Walter's peripheral vision. Crawford selected a simpler black Oxford. No cap toe, no embellishments, just a plain, understated shoe, the kind worn by thousands of government employees across Washington. The exchange was conducted smoothly. If Crawford sensed anything unusual, he didn't show it. He left with the new shoes, his stride exactly as before, rigid, symmetrical, trained. As soon as the door closed behind him, Morrison, already on his radio, began issuing quiet commands. Surveillance teams shadowed Crawford as he moved down Connecticut Avenue, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians. Walter watched from the doorway, only long enough to see the agents fall into step before retreating inside. Heart still pounding with the strange realization that his shop, normally a haven of routine, had become the center of a Cold War operation. The investigation that followed unfolded far beyond the scope of Walter's daily life, yet he remained part of its quiet foundation. Over the next 3 weeks, the FBI built a mosaic of information around Crawford. They tracked his movements, documented his contacts, analyzed his patterns. What emerged was not the picture of an ordinary federal analyst. It was the portrait of a handler, a Soviet intelligence officer who operated under deep cover, coordinating a network of sources planted throughout the federal bureaucracy. What Walter had sensed instinctively, the FBI now confirmed through hard evidence. Crawford was not just collecting documents, he was running an operation. He met sources in public parks, exchanged coded messages disguised as innocuous paperwork, used dead drops, maintained elaborate communication protocols with Soviet handlers. His network included at least 7 Americans who had access to sensitive economic and military data that had been leaking for years, shaping Soviet expectations in trade negotiations, revealing procurement details, potentially altering the global balance in subtle but significant ways. In late November, the FBI moved. Crawford, whose real name, they would later reveal, was Alexei Vulov, was arrested in the early morning hours. His apartment was raided. 6 of his sources were arrested across the city. Classified material was seized. And by the afternoon, newspapers across the country ran headlines about a Soviet espionage ring broken inside the U.S. government. But in the fine print, almost no one knew that the first thread had been pulled by a quiet cobbler on Connecticut Avenue, who saw what others did not. When news of the arrests broke, Washington reacted with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and weary resignation. Spy scandals were not new to the capital, far from it. But the idea that a Soviet intelligence officer had operated undetected for more than half a decade within the Department of Commerce, quietly siphoning data that shaped global economic strategy, rattled even the most seasoned officials. The headlines focused on the espionage network, the security breach, the classified documents. But for Walter Patterson, the moment felt surreal. He sat alone in his small office after closing, the newspaper folded across his desk, his reading glasses resting beside it. He stared not at the text, but at the grainy black and white photograph of the man he had known as Martin Crawford. Except that wasn't his name. According to investigators, his true identity was Alexei Vulov, a GRU officer trained in Moscow, embedded in the United States under deep cover sometime in the early 1960s. His legend, his fabricated identity, had been constructed with meticulous detail, the kind of thoroughness that Soviet intelligence prided itself on. Documentation, education records, tax history, employment references, even a plausible personal narrative. He had lived as an American for so long that he had nearly become one. Nearly, because no amount of training could erase the instinctive rigidity of his Soviet military gait, and that, ultimately, had been his undoing. The trial began the following spring. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters, some seeking Cold War drama, others looking for human interest angles, in a story already legendary among law enforcement circles. Walter had been notified weeks earlier that he would be called to testify. The idea had filled him with dread at first. He wasn't a public speaker, nor someone who enjoyed commanding a room. He fit shoes, not audiences. Yet, as he sat outside the courtroom on a wooden bench, polished smooth by decades of wear, he felt something else beneath the anxiety. Resolve. Morrison had prepared him meticulously, going over his testimony repeatedly until every detail flowed cleanly. What Walter had observed was not speculation. It was expertise. It was pattern recognition refined over decades. It was the kind of intuitive skill that couldn't be taught in intelligence academies or captured in manuals. It was the craft of a cobbler who understood the language of movement. When Walter was finally called to the stand, the courtroom air seemed to thicken. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and took his seat. The prosecution began gently, asking him to describe his family's trade, his experience fitting shoes, the thousands of customers he had observed over nearly 30 years. Walter explained the subtle mechanics of posture, balance, footfall. He spoke of how a person's gait revealed more about their upbringing and training than words ever could. Then he described Vulov. He recounted the rigid spine, the symmetrical stride, the mechanical arm swing. He explained the wear patterns on the shoes, how they revealed uniform pressure distribution rarely seen in civilians. He noted the slight delay in facial expressions, the scanning of the room, the upside-down newspaper. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts stand on their own. The defense attempted to dismiss his observations as subjective. They questioned his lack of formal training in psychology, biomechanics, or law enforcement. They tried to paint him as a well-meaning but overconfident shopkeeper. But the prosecution countered with a simple truth. Walter's observations had triggered the investigation that ultimately uncovered irrefutable evidence: classified documents in Vulov's apartment, photographic surveillance of meetings with known Soviet contacts, intercepted signals intelligence confirming his GRU affiliation. Walter's testimony was not the foundation of the case. It was the spark that lit the fuse. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, he felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. He returned to his bench in the hallway, hands trembling slightly. Morrison joined him minutes later, offering a quiet nod. "You did well," the agent said. "Better than well. You told the truth, and that's what mattered." Walter nodded, though he wasn't sure how to feel. Pride didn't seem appropriate. Neither did triumph. The entire ordeal felt oddly heavy, as though he had glimpsed a hidden world and would never quite forget the shadows he had seen there. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Guilty. Alexei Vulov, alias Martin Crawford, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. 6 of his American sources received sentences between 10 and 18 years. The espionage network was officially dismantled. Newspapers reported that although the intelligence damage was significant, it had been contained before it could evolve into something catastrophic. Life returned to an uneasy normal. For a while, Walter found his shop busier than ever. Word had spread, quietly through bureaucratic circles, that the man who fitted shoes on Connecticut Avenue had helped catch a spy. Diplomats came out of curiosity. Congressional aides stopped by just to look around. Even a few intelligence analysts visited under the pretense of buying footwear. Though their questions revealed their true purpose, they wanted to meet the cobbler who had noticed what no one else had. Walter deflected most of the attention. He did not enjoy the role of folk hero. He preferred to talk about arch support and leather quality rather than espionage. But David Chen, who finally learned the full story after the trial ended, teased him relentlessly. "Washington's most unlikely counterintelligence asset," David said one morning as he arranged a display of loafers. "Should we put that on the window? Might help business." Walter rolled his eyes, but he smiled. The attention was temporary. The world moved on quickly, especially in a city like Washington, where crises layered over one another with dizzying speed. Within months, the story faded from front pages and settled into the quiet archives of Cold War history. But Walter never forgot. He had glimpsed a truth that most Americans never saw: that espionage did not always unfold in dark alleys or behind embassy walls. It unfolded in daylight, in offices, in quiet neighborhoods, in the everyday routines people took for granted. It was a conflict conducted in whispers and glances, where the most dangerous adversaries were often the ones who blended perfectly into the landscape. Years later, long after the Soviet Union dissolved and the Cold War ended, Walter would still think about that moment. The moment he saw a man walk into his shop and sensed, without knowing why, that something was wrong. It reminded him that history often turned on the smallest details, that patriotism sometimes meant speaking up, even at the risk of appearing foolish, that ordinary people could change the outcome of extraordinary events simply by paying attention. Patterson and Sons continued to operate into the 1990s, eventually passing to David when Walter finally retired. The shop remained beloved, its reputation anchored in the same craftsmanship and quiet dignity that Walter had always valued. On occasion, FBI trainees visited to hear Walter speak about observation, detail, and instinct. His lectures were simple, practical, grounded in experience rather than theory. The best sensors, he told them, are human eyes, trained, curious, and honest. Technology can record everything, but it takes a person to notice what matters. When Walter Patterson died in 2003, his obituary in the Washington Post honored his role in the Crawford case, describing him as a citizen whose alertness had helped protect national security during one of the tensest eras in American history. But the obituary also emphasized what Walter himself cared about most: his craftsmanship, his devotion to his customers, his family legacy. He had not sought glory. He had not chased adventure. He had simply noticed something that others overlooked and acted. In the end, it was enough. Years after the courtroom lights dimmed and the Cold War itself slipped into the rear view of history, the story of the quiet cobbler who caught a Soviet spy began taking on a life of its own. Not because Walter Patterson sought attention, he never did, but because the lesson embedded within the story resonated far beyond the Cold War, beyond espionage, beyond Washington itself. It was a story about vigilance, about instinct, about the extraordinary power of ordinary people to shape events in ways they never could have predicted. Inside the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., visitors today walk past a glass case displaying an unremarkable pair of black Oxfords. Plain, polished, understated. They could belong to any of the thousands of mid-level government workers who populate the Capitol's office buildings. But the placard beside them explains otherwise. These shoes were the pair purchased by Soviet GRU officer Alexei Vulov, operating under the alias Martin Crawford, during his final weeks of freedom. They were the shoes that brought him into Patterson & Sons, the shoes that allowed a cobbler's trained eyes to perceive the cracks in an otherwise flawless cover, the shoes that, indirectly, exposed a Soviet espionage network. Visitors often lean in close, expecting perhaps to see some obvious clue, some mark, some oddity, some spy-like feature. But there is nothing unusual about them. That's the point. Their power lies not in what they reveal visually, but in what they helped Walter perceive, that the smallest overlooked details can unspool the grandest of secrets. Walter never lived to see the museum display, though he knew before his passing that the shoes had been donated. He found it amusing, even humbling. "Imagine that," he said once to his wife, "a pair of shoes doing more important work than some of the people who wear them." He said it with a smile, but he meant every word. His lectures at the FBI Academy became modestly legendary. Simple talks delivered by a soft-spoken man with silver-rimmed glasses and hands toughened by decades of craft. Young agents entered expecting some dramatic anecdote about spy-catching theatrics. Instead, Walter spoke of arch supports, posture, symmetry, and the subtle art of paying attention. He explained that intelligence work was not just about gadgets or clandestine meetings. It was about cultivating an awareness of the ordinary. Not every clue shouts. Not every threat arrives in disguise. Sometimes the truth reveals itself in the way someone carries their weight, or in the way they walk through the world. He taught them something profound, that detail is not merely decorative, it's diagnostic. To those young agents, he would recount his father's old OSS wisdom. Everyone carries their origins in their body. Habits become history. History becomes movement. And movement doesn't lie. Walter liked to emphasize that he never set out to catch a spy. He simply trusted his instincts because they were built on decades of observation. "I didn't know he was a spy," he would say. "I only knew he moved like someone trying not to move the way he was trained." It was that distinction, subtle, fragile, and razor-thin, that made all the difference. Meanwhile, life at Patterson & Sons continued as the world evolved around it. David Chen took over the business in 1990, carrying forward the tradition of fine craftsmanship and respectful service. Customers still came in seeking comfort, quality, or a little stability in uncertain times. And though most had no idea about the Cold War legend connected to the shop, a few came specifically to stand on the same tile floor where a Soviet spy had once tested a disguise that ultimately failed him. David never exploited the story. He honored Walter's humility. But sometimes, when a customer asked about the framed print hanging behind the counter, a quiet photograph of Walter smiling beneath the shop's sign, David would share the story in his own gentle way. It was never dramatic, never inflated. Just a story about a man who noticed something most people wouldn't. A story about how the Cold War didn't just play out in secrets, exchanged between embassies, but also in the ordinary rhythms of American life. After Walter's passing in 2003, his obituary captured the essence of the man: a patriotic citizen, a skilled craftsman, a humble observer whose alertness had protected national security during a dangerous era. Yet those who knew him understood the deeper truth. Walter's legacy extended beyond the spy he helped expose. It lived on in the philosophy he left behind, that attentiveness is a civic virtue, that ordinary people can shape history simply by refusing to look away. The Cold War produced countless tales of intrigue, double agents, defectors, elaborate tradecraft, dangerous games of deception carried out in the shadows of Moscow and Washington. Most of these stories featured professionals hardened by training and ideology. But Walter's story was different. His gift came not from espionage manuals or intelligence briefings, but from a lifetime spent watching people move, how leather conformed to bone, how posture adapted to habit, how the body spoke in truths deeper than words. In his story lies a reminder: expertise comes in many forms, not all of them glamorous. A spy can be caught by a satellite image or by a brilliant codebreaker. But sometimes, he's caught because a quiet cobbler recognizes the unmistakable rhythm of a trained march. And that is what makes this story timeless. History is not shaped only by those who command armies or negotiate treaties. It is also shaped by citizens who pay attention, people who sense when something is wrong, people who trust their instincts, people who act even when they fear looking foolish. In a world increasingly driven by technology and algorithms, Walter Patterson's life stands as a testament to the enduring power of human observation. The shoes in the glass case at the Spy Museum may appear ordinary, but they symbolize a powerful truth. Extraordinary outcomes often begin with the simplest acts of awareness. The Cold War ended. Empires fell. New threats rose. But Walter's quiet victory remains etched into history, not because he sought recognition, but because he understood that even in the shadows of global conflict, one person paying attention can alter the course of events. The man who caught a spy did so not with a badge or a gun or a briefing folder stamped "Top Secret," but with his eyes, his craft, and his unwavering belief that small details matter.